Well, it's a pleasure to welcome to ENCA. I'm joined by Edward Mafatsa from the religious protection body, the CRL Rights Commission. You'll know that commission by now as well. A regular guest here on ENCA, Bishop Malusi Mpumwana from the SA Council of Churches. Gentlemen, afternoon to both of you. Thank you for coming in to speak to us. Bishop, perhaps if I can start with you, and Edward, I will ask you the same to get your thoughts on this, the same question. Perhaps let's start from today, Bishop, and work backwards. You would have seen that story we were running. Atu Mtungana was there this morning. The shutting down of this church by protesters. What did you make of that a building that's being used as a church being shut down by protesters? What was your initial reaction?
Well, interesting that it is said to have been shut down over rezoning issues. Where were these rezoning issues before? There are so many such churches all over the country in the cities. And what actually happened to the zoning rights, I don't know. So if there's a zoning issue, the question would be, why would it have waited for today? But I think that the public outcry is related to, I think it's aroused by the evidence that was led by Cheryl last week, because, again, the same community was there. They never made this call. I think it really is the sudden outpouring of reaction as a result of what they've heard. And, you know, there are 30 others. We're still going to hear more and more and more.
Edward, what do you make of a church being shut down like that? Well, apart from the zoning issues, this protest was going to happen, it seems, regardless of that. What did you make of the protest outside to shut a place of worship?
Well, we as a commission wouldn't support any closure of a place of worship, if indeed it is a place of worship. But if it is having challenges and people are not satisfied, I think it is rational, it is justified for the church to be closed. But you must remember the church does not belong to one man, it belongs to a community. So even if some people are eliminated from the church, the community, if they are serious about their religion, they should be able to carry on. But once it is really painted badly, we do support that really, because now it borders from being a church or something else. If it is not a church, we should shut it down.
Bishop, if it's not a church, what is it, a cult? What do you make of this?
There was, given the indictment and the evidence that's coming through so far, one can only say it is what John Foster would have called the den of iniquity. Remember that he once referred to Welgersplate, which was really a place that was sensitizing people to be able to relate racially. He called that a den of iniquity. This is what a den of iniquity actually looks like, because there's all those things are totally iniquitous. And certainly, I wouldn't have referred to a person who does things like that as a pastor. It actually is a misrepresentation of the meaning of the word pastor. And so, definitely, if that's what's happening, it is not a church.
And we want to be very clear on this.
It's not even a cult. It's not even a cult.
It's not even a cult.
No.
What would you call it?
It's a den of iniquity. That's what I'd call it.
That's what they're going to call it. So a den of iniquity in this case, the CRL Commission are going to have to deal with this. But we were just talking about the freedom of association, the freedom of religion. How does the Commission now begin to decide what is a church, what's a den of iniquity, what's a cult, I think was the word I was going with as well. How does the Commission begin to come up with what they define to be a church or something else, and then how do you prevent people who seemingly, on their own free will, are willing to go there and support a man who's currently on trial, and by supporting him, therefore supporting his church and his beliefs?
I'm happy the bishop is here to tell us what the church is this afternoon. But as a commission, you will remember that all that we do, we measure it against the Constitution of the Republic. So if there are certain attributes of the Bill of Rights that are being violated, even if it's a church, even if it's any religious institution, we have a duty to respond ourselves. Because you see, even if we have the freedom of religion as part of the right, that very same right is competing with human dignity. And human dignity is actually the right that we, all of us in South Africa, take very seriously, even more than sometimes other rights, because of our background and because of where we come from. So we look at those things, and we say as a commission that once a church is tampering with issues of other rights like human dignity, we should ask ourselves questions as a commission, as a nation, as communities that indeed is this a real church or is something else? Then we make that judgment. So we need to balance this, the issues of human dignity and religious freedom.
I think it's very important as well, Bishop, as I come back to you as well, that the allegation made by Cheryl Zondi is when she was still a 14-year-old girl. So despite what the church may or may not be and the definition thereof, the accusation is from an underage girl towards a pastor. How do you, Bishop, then imagine, despite the followers that are still in court and supporting Omotoso, and the church up until this morning was still functioning, how does the church get itself out of a mess like this with this underage abuse? Abuse at the best of times and at the worst of times is awful, but the abuse of underage children. How does the church begin to deal with something like this?
Well, I think that in the first instance, this is a power game. And I think that if they were talking about a church now, there are many parallel instances where power is used to groom and abuse young children, boys or girls. This happens in churches, this happens in Sangoma situations, this happens in schools. And so we need to then be able to say, how do you deal with adults that abuse their power over children? If it's in the context of the church, then the question is, do such churches actually, should they exist? Should they be recognized as churches? I think this is where the Civil Rights Commission's recommendations come in, where they say that every church or pastor must be affiliated to a structure that gives them authorization to function.
There's nothing like that exists right now.
Well, it's not obligatory. There's no requirement that this should be the case, which is why Malusi can wake up one morning and call himself a bishop and say people must come over, and they do that.
Why does the CRL Commission, forgive me, Pastor, for jumping in, why does the CRL Commission not jump onto churches like that? Are you made aware only after the fact, or how are you made aware of churches that could be problematic, or do you only wait until it ends up in the media?
Well, if we're informed by the communities, if complainants come to our commission, that's one way of knowing. But also, if the media covers that, that's another way of knowing. But sometimes you may find that we also, like any other person or any other institution, come across such issues in our engagements with the communities. Then we pick up those issues and then we deal with them. So in terms of how we get it, it depends. We look at different angles. Our engagement, the media, people walking into the commission, some people reporting on behalf of others, then we deal. And we rely also in religious institutions, like your SACC and others, to say when they have these challenges, they also forward. And they've done that in the past, and we appreciate that. And we're encouraging many structures and communities to come up and actually report these cases also to the commission.
Bishop, we need to be very careful when we start comparing this particular church to pastors we've seen in recent years abusing congregants by making them eat grass, drink petrol. We all know of those churches. This pastor, this Omotoso, is accused of sexual grooming and human trafficking. As far as his testimony and the preaching of the word of God goes, what do we know about him? Yes, there's the allegations against him of rape of underage girls and trafficking. What was the church itself like? Do we know if there's any issues as far as the preaching of the word is concerned?
We wouldn't have known anything until this happened. So because there's so many churches, until something like what the commissioner is saying, we can't know. In the case of the grass pastor, again, because things came up in the media, we went there and tried to engage and tried to persuade him to sort of change his ways, and that didn't succeed. And so we reported him to the Human Rights Commission that passed it on to CRL Rights Commission. So it's difficult to know because one never knows what goes on in a building that's called a church until somebody says something untoward. And this is why I think really the idea of churches being recognized, there must be some kind of question before they are registered. Right now, the registration of churches is at the Department of Social Development, like any other NPO. And maybe the case can be made, as the Civil Rights Commission is making, that there should be a special registration for churches in a way that is uniquely designed for churches, so that, again, the questions of what the practices are of that church can also be recognized.
Let's talk about special cases and special courts, perhaps, if we could, for a moment, gentlemen. Edward, perhaps let me start with you. I know the Bishop touched on this a little bit earlier. I'd like to unpack the idea of a special court for sexual offences. Now a 22-year-old Cheryl Zondi, back then a 14-year-old. ENCA is running on air at the moment, in between ad breaks, ask a promotional question, asking, is this justice, what we are seeing? And it's a very open-ended question, whether it be Cheryl Zondi coming forward, whether it be the cross-examination that we've been seeing, or whether or not even the media should be allowed to broadcast what we have, even though she's agreed in court to be on live TV, the trial and its proceedings. Do you believe what we've been seeing the past few days on television is justice?
Maybe it's a blessing in disguise for the nation, so that the nation can get to know what is happening within the religious sector. Because if it was not covered the way it was, many people will still be denying the fact that there are some things that are happening within the religious sector that are not correct. So it's a blessing for us in one way to understand that. But it's also a pity that we find ourselves in that state as a nation, wherein we have to pick up a young lady to stand up and talk about these things, when we have very senior people within the religious sector who should actually be taking the responsibility to know exactly what is happening within the religious sector. So it's an unfortunate situation, but we take it as a blessing that many people, and those that were perhaps hiding somewhere, will be able to stand up and talk and follow what Cheryl has been doing, so that, we can together be able to tackle this challenge within the religious sector.
Bearing in mind as well, Bishop, the allegation is still being tested in court, and I think it's worth remembering that Omotoso will have, if he chooses to, will still have his time in the stand to put his version forward. But from what we've seen so far, off the back of what I was asking Edward, do you believe what we've been seeing is justice?
If I were his attorney, I would say it's not justice, because I would say my client is being prejudiced. But I actually think that there is no way you can have, you cannot have privatized that kind of practice and not let it come out into the open. Let society judge for themselves. It is justice in that regard. But I also want to say that if this young lady is coming forward so many years later than when she began, it must say that there are many others who are groomed very early who were not in a position to actually speak out. Now, I think you might know that the SACC had a program a couple of years ago that was called the Unburdening Process Against Corruption, where we started out by saying those people that have had an experience must come forward and have their private time. And you know what? The bulk of the people that came to us said, I just want to unburden myself and be able to sleep. I don't want anybody to know I spoke to you. Don't even tell my story, because they'll know it's me and I fear for my life. We believe we ought to open something similar for religious sector, to say those people that would be afraid to go public like she did would at least have some space where they can go. We think that's something that we ought to do, and say that we're inviting all those people that are feeling abused, who might not even want to make a story of it. And we've already had a couple, just this past week, of people talking to say that we would like to be able to talk to someone.
Edward, as we begin to wrap up our discussion this afternoon, we can carry on forever. There's so many topics, and I know as the trial continues, we will be speaking to the two of you again as we move forward. Perhaps let me leave last question with you, Edward, and then I'll come to you, Bishop, for a final word. Do you think the trust of churches globally, but perhaps more so in South Africa, is gone?
Slowly going. I was just in the U.S. Last week attending the Human Dignity and Freedom of Religion. And when they relate to some of the things that are happening in South Africa, you can tell that they feel that South Africa is living somewhere else. It's not like actually part of the world in terms of what is happening, because they are comparing what is happening within the religious sector with the other things that are happening in their own setups. And it's quite different, but they are reading the same Bible. So yes, that trust is slowly going away for the ordinary, community members. But that trust is also built up again by people like Bishop Mpumulwana and the SACC and your other structures led by other senior people who command respect in our communities, because they are able to stand up and rebuild that trust. Because the fact that he allowed himself to come and talk about this is again to say, let us separate these practices from what the church stands for. And that, I think, builds the trust.
Bishop, final word to you. Is the trust in the South African church gone?
I would say that South Africa is a very religious society. And that is also the reason why you have droves of people, for example, about 300 a month, going to Nigeria or TB Joshua, even though many people have died. I don't think that it is an issue of trust in the church, or at least in religiosity per se. But I think that there is a lot of misguidedness in the way we practice our religiosity, which is why I think that the issue of looking at how those churches are functioning and are established is actually a valid issue to pursue.
All right, my thanks to both of you for coming in. No doubts we will be getting perspective from both of you as we move forward in this court case, which is set to get underway again by tomorrow. It's a huge pleasure to have had on the show Edward Mafatsa from the religious protection body, the CRL Rights Commission, and always a pleasure with Bishop Malusi Mpumwana from the SA Council of Churches, joining us here on ENCA Now.